Some stories don't just inspire, they stay with you forever. This is Marcus's journey, a powerful tale of resilience, courage, and rising above life's toughest challenges. It's a story that will move your heart, ignite your spirit, and change the way you see the world. Don't miss a moment. Hit subscribe now, and let's dive into this unforgettable journey together. Marcus navigated his old, rusted truck over the uneven gravel of Hunter's Roadhouse parking lot, the engine's rattle fading into the evening air as he parked it off to one side. The South Carolina night stretched ahead, silent and cool, broken only by the occasional chirp of a cricket or the distant hum of a passing car on the highway. This part of the world, tucked away in the backroads, felt like a place where time slowed down, where life's complexities, at least for a moment, seemed a distant concern. He had driven for hours, seeking nothing but peace, after weeks of being back home, weeks spent in a blur of family reunions, expectations, and at times, overwhelming emotions. Marcus needed a break, a place where no one knew his name, where no one expected anything from him. Hunter's Roadhouse, a small, unassuming bar just off the highway, was exactly the kind of refuge he sought. The sign outside flickered faintly, an old neon glow, and the building itself looked as if it hadn't changed much in the decades it had stood there. Wooden planks darkened by years of rain and sun, the smell of aged beer and fried food escaping through the door as it swung open to welcome him in. Inside, the bar was dimly lit, with only a few tables occupied by locals who seemed to have found their own rhythm in the place. The clink of glasses, the low murmur of conversation, and the occasional chuckle or burst of laughter formed a comforting backdrop to the stillness Marcus had been craving. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of grease and stale beer instantly enveloping him. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would call fancy, but it had a warmth to it that made it feel like home. With a quiet nod to the bartender, who glanced up briefly before returning to his task, Marcus made his way past the pool table in the back and chose a corner booth, furthest from the door and the chatter. He slid into the booth, feeling the weight of the long journey settle on his shoulders. His body, still aching from the tension of months spent on deployment, found some solace in the worn vinyl seat. He rubbed his hands together slowly, taking in the simple comfort of the moment. The jukebox hummed softly in the corner, a few notes of country music mixing with the soft conversation that swirled around him. His thoughts drifted, unbidden, to his family. The reunion had been everything he'd hoped for, and yet more complicated than he could have imagined. His wife, his kids, faces he'd dreamed of every night while overseas, were now here, in front of him. But somehow, things weren't the same. He couldn't shake the feeling that the months of distance had created a gap he wasn't sure how to bridge. They'd been adjusting, but he felt as though he'd missed something, some vital shift that had happened while he was gone. The soft flicker of a nearby light and the low hum of conversation seemed to wash away the tension. For the first time in a long while, Marcus let himself relax. No one here knew him as the soldier. No one knew the weight he carried. In this moment, he was just a man, sitting in a booth, wanting nothing more than a quiet drink and some time to himself. He took a deep breath, savoring the stillness, and ordered a drink from the bartender. A quiet murmur and a nod were all it took. As the glass was placed in front of him, the cool amber liquid inside reflected the dim lights above. He raised it slowly, the glass warm in his hand, and took a long sip. It burned going down, but the sensation was grounding, like a reminder that he was alive, that he was here, in this moment, free from the burdens of his past and future obligations. The evening stretched on, slow and unhurried. He glanced around the room, noticing a couple of regulars deep in conversation by the bar, their voices low but filled with the kind of familiarity that only years of shared history could build. A few others were scattered around, mostly lost in their own worlds, their faces worn from the daily grind of life, but softened by the comfort of the roadhouse. For Marcus, it was a rare, fleeting feeling, a sense of being untethered, as though he had momentarily stepped outside the web of responsibilities and expectations that had held him tightly in place for so long. He allowed himself to drift, his thoughts moving like gentle waves on a calm sea. He wasn't thinking about what he'd left behind or what lay ahead. He was simply here, in the now, letting the world move on around him while he remained in the quiet center of it all. As the minutes passed, the bar continued its gentle rhythm, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over him. It was almost as if the world outside had paused for a while, allowing him to catch his breath. He hadn't realized just how much he'd needed this small moment of stillness, until it was finally here. It was something simple, yet profound, a fleeting chance to just be. The hum of the jukebox faded as a new sound sliced through the air, deep, throaty roars of motorcycle engines that echoed off the walls and shook the very foundation of the roadhouse. Marcus had become so accustomed to the soothing rhythm of the bar that the sudden disruption hit him like a jolt. He looked up instinctively, his peace momentarily shattered by the clamor of the bikes pulling into the lot. The door swung open with a loud creak, and the group of 6 bikers entered, their presence as commanding as their engines had been. The warmth of the roadhouse seemed to dissipate as they made their entrance, the air shifting with their bold, unspoken energy. Their leather jackets, patched with various symbols of brotherhood, told a story of countless miles traveled and a bond forged through shared experience. The smell of fresh leather mixed with the faint scent of exhaust fumes as the group crowded into the bar, each step deliberate, their boots hitting the floor like the cadence of a drum beat. Laughter broke out among the group as they exchanged loud words, their voices rich with camaraderie and a sense of unrestrained freedom. It was the kind of energy that filled a room, pulling the attention of everyone present. The regulars, who had been lost in their own thoughts, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyeing the newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Marcus, who had been lost in his own thoughts, felt his muscles tense instinctively. He leaned back in his booth, but his eyes remained focused on the group, watching them as they made their way to the bar. They moved in unison, like a well-oiled machine, each of them taking their place as though they were at home in this world. Their leader, a burly man with a weathered beard and a gruff demeanor, commanded the most attention. His name was Jack, a presence so imposing that even the low murmur of conversation seemed to hush in his wake. Jack was built like a mountain, his broad shoulders and muscular frame straining against the fabric of his leather vest. His face, weathered by years of sun and hardship, seemed to tell stories without a single word being spoken. As the bikers settled in at the bar, Jack's eyes swept across the room. His gaze was sharp, scanning the faces of the patrons. But then, for a reason Marcus couldn't yet understand, his gaze lingered on him. Marcus, seated in the quiet corner, felt it instantly. The heat of someone's stare. He didn't flinch, didn't turn to meet Jack's eyes. He had long learned to keep his focus, even when it felt like the weight of someone's attention was bearing down on him. Still, Jack's gaze didn't waver. For a moment, Marcus tried to push the feeling aside, hoping that the tension wouldn't shift in his direction. But Jack didn't look away. The silence between them seemed to stretch, even as the noise of the bar continued around them. The other bikers were too absorbed in their laughter, their chatter, and the clinking of glass to notice the exchange. But Marcus could feel it. The sudden awareness in the room, the way the atmosphere seemed to grow heavy. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly, and in the quietest of moments, he made his decision. Without a word, he stepped away from his crew and began walking toward Marcus, each step deliberate, like the beat of a drum growing louder. The bar seemed to quieten just a little more, as if the patrons sensed that something was about to change. The bikers behind Jack continued their boisterous banter, not noticing the shift, but the air around Marcus seemed to thicken. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Jack reached Marcus's table, his heavy boots sounding like thunder against the wooden floor. The laughter in the bar died down slightly, and even the jukebox seemed to fade into the background. Jack stopped just a few feet from Marcus's booth, standing there for a moment, his presence almost too large for the small space between them. His eyes flickered to Marcus's military uniform, then back to his face, sizing him up as if trying to decipher a puzzle. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't move a muscle. His eyes remained steady, focused, as Jack's shadow loomed over him. It was a challenge, unspoken yet clear. Well, Jack's voice broke the silence, gruff and laced with something that might have been curiosity or disdain. Marcus couldn't tell. What's a soldier like you doing in a place like this? His gaze dropped briefly to Marcus's worn sneakers, the ones that had seen too many miles in the sand and dust. Those shoes don't exactly scream combat ready, do they? The other bikers at the bar, sensing the shift in the room, grew quiet. Marcus could feel their eyes on him now, the quiet hum of their attention surrounding him like a cloud. He wasn't sure whether Jack was genuinely interested or simply looking for a reason to escalate things. But he didn't give him the satisfaction of an immediate response. Instead, Marcus took a slow breath, steadying himself, before he glanced up at Jack and spoke calmly. "I'm just here for a drink," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "Nothing more, nothing less." Jack studied him for a moment, the lines on his face deepening as he seemed to weigh the situation. Then a half smile crept across his face, though it was anything but friendly. "Is that so?" Jack asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A soldier just looking for a drink, huh? You sure you didn't come here looking for some sympathy?" He leaned in closer, his breath heavy with the smell of whiskey. "What, you expect everyone here to stand up and thank you for your service? Is that it?" Marcus felt the rising tension in the air, the sting of the challenge in Jack's words. He could feel the eyes of the entire room now, locked on him, waiting for his response. But Marcus knew that this was a test, one he'd faced many times before, in far more dangerous places. He met Jack's gaze steadily, his hands gripping the edge of the table just enough to steady himself. "I don't need anyone's thanks," Marcus replied, his voice calm, measured. "I'm not here for that." The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Jack didn't immediately respond, but Marcus could see the flicker of something, anger, maybe even respect, in the biker's eyes. For a moment, it felt like they were suspended in time, the weight of their silent exchange hanging in the air like a storm about to break. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the moment passed. Jack stood there for another second, his eyes still on Marcus, before he straightened up and let out a low chuckle. "Suit yourself," he said, as though the words were a dismissal. He turned, but not before giving Marcus one last look, a gaze that lingered just long enough to send a silent signal to his crew. The rest of the bikers returned to their conversation, though the air in the bar had shifted. The tension, once thick, now hung in a quieter form, waiting for the next move. Marcus leaned back in his booth, taking another sip of his drink. He didn't allow himself to think too much about Jack's words. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. And tonight, he had no intention of letting anything, especially a man like Jack, derail his peace. But the night, it seemed, was only just beginning. After Jack's casual dismissal, the tension in the bar lingered, hanging like a storm cloud just on the horizon. The bikers, with their loud laughter and rough camaraderie, gradually began to settle into their usual rhythm at the bar, but Jack's gaze kept drifting back to Marcus. Every time Marcus thought he could breathe a little easier, the unmistakable weight of Jack's stare pulled him back. It wasn't an overt challenge, but something about it made Marcus feel like he was being weighed, measured, and found wanting. Jack leaned in toward his companions, his voice low, but the sharp edge of his words unmistakable. A few of the bikers, looking to him for guidance, leaned in as well, their faces hardening, their smirks barely visible beneath their thick beards. Marcus could see them out of the corner of his eye, their eyes flicking to him, then to each other, sharing silent conversations as their laughter began to swell in volume. At first, the jokes were subtle, little cracks of laughter that barely registered over the low hum of the bar. But it didn't take long for the insults to grow more pointed. The laughter, once casual, turned mocking. Jack's voice rose above the others, though not by much, just enough to be heard clearly across the room. "Hey, soldier," Jack called, his voice laced with sarcasm. "What's the deal with those shoes? Are you trying to start a new military fashion trend, or just trying to look like you walked through a thrift store on your way here?" The rest of the group erupted into laughter, the sound booming across the bar, causing a few of the regulars to glance nervously at one another. The bartender's eyes flicked briefly in their direction, but he said nothing. The biker's energy was infectious, too loud to ignore, and for the first time, Marcus felt the weight of their attention settle on him like a blanket, suffocating and unwanted. He could feel the heat of their gazes on him, the hostile energy swirling in the air like smoke. Despite the jabs, Marcus didn't flinch. He kept his eyes forward, staring into his glass as he took another slow sip. He was used to this. He'd encountered hostility before, in places where the stakes were higher, where the enemy wasn't just a group of rowdy bikers, but the kind of people who didn't hesitate to make a soldier's life miserable. Here, the insults were hollow, noise meant to provoke. But Marcus had learned long ago how to filter out the noise, how to focus on something more meaningful than the venom of petty men. Still, the mockery persisted, sharpening in its intensity as the bikers continued their taunting. Jack, emboldened by the attention, leaned back in his seat and raised his voice even further, aiming his words directly at Marcus. "Tell me, man, how much does that uniform weigh? I bet you could have picked up some new boots instead of wearing those ratty sneakers." His eyes flicked toward the worn laces of Marcus's shoes. "Or are you one of those soldiers who thinks wearing the uniform gets him some kind of free pass? That what this is? A pity party?" The group howled with laughter, the sound now filled with malice, their eyes gleaming as they waited for Marcus to react. But Marcus didn't respond, his expression unreadable as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. His fingers tightened slightly around the glass, but he didn't let his emotions show. He'd been here before. This was nothing new. The rest of the bar seemed to shrink into the background, as if the room had grown smaller, tighter. Even the bartender seemed to sense the shift in the air, his movements slowing as if waiting for something to happen. The occasional clink of glasses no longer seemed to fill the space. The world outside the bar, the highway, the fields, everything seemed to fade into the background. One of the other bikers, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, leaned in toward Jack and whispered something, a conspiratorial grin spreading across his face. Jack's smirk deepened in response, and he turned back toward Marcus, his eyes narrowing as he spoke louder this time. "Tell me, soldier, do you think you're some kind of hero just because you wear that uniform?" Jack asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "I don't see any medals on you. What, did you get that jacket from a costume shop? Some dress-up soldier?" The words stung, cutting through the thickening silence with sharp precision. This time, the mocking laughter that followed didn't sound like the kind of teasing that could be ignored. There was venom in it, something more dangerous than the harmless ribbing of a drunk man. This was a challenge, a deliberate attempt to provoke, to strip away Marcus's dignity and make him bow to their mockery. And yet, Marcus remained composed, his face betraying nothing. But inside, he could feel something stir, a sense of rising frustration, something that made his jaw clench. It would have been easy to respond, to let his anger lash out in a moment of pride. But he knew better. He had been trained for moments like this, trained to keep his emotions in check, to rise above the petty attempts to drag him down. And so, he sat there, staring into his drink, the bitterness of the alcohol almost soothing as it slid down his throat. But the air was thick with hostility now, and Marcus could feel the change. He knew this wouldn't be over so easily. Jack and his crew weren't going to let it slide. They wouldn't just drop their little game, not now that they had an audience. The room had quieted in response to their taunts, everyone waiting for the next move, as if they could sense the storm building. And Jack, sensing the quiet tension, wasn't about to let it go either. He wasn't finished. He leaned in again, his voice a low growl now, aimed directly at Marcus. "Why don't you show us what you're made of, huh?" Jack sneered. "You're not afraid, are you? You've got all that training, so why don't you show us just how tough you really are?" The words hung in the air, a challenge laced with mockery, daring Marcus to take the bait. This time, Marcus could feel it, the weight of the situation pressing in. There was a decision to make. Would he stand his ground, or would he let them push him further? The room held its breath, the stillness palpable. Marcus had no intention of giving in to their cruelty. But even he couldn't deny that the tension was thick, the air humming with the anticipation of what might come next. The atmosphere in the bar crackled, the thick tension hanging in the air like an electric charge, and it was clear that the simmering hostility was about to boil over. The air had grown heavier, the murmurs of other patrons fading into the background as Jack pushed himself from the bar, his boots thumping heavily against the wooden floor with each deliberate step. Every stride seemed to drum in Marcus's ears, the sound echoing in the silence that had fallen between them. Jack's eyes remained fixed on Marcus as he made his way toward the table, his wide frame cutting through the crowd with an ease that demanded attention. The others followed behind, their laughter now a low rumble of satisfaction. But it was Jack who led, towering above Marcus with an air of superiority. As he reached Marcus's table, he paused for just a moment, his sneer spreading across his weathered face before speaking. "So what's the deal, soldier?" Jack's voice was thick with sarcasm, the words dragging like nails down a chalkboard. He leaned in slightly, the smell of stale whiskey and sweat on his breath. "Did you get that uniform from a Halloween store, or are you just here to play dress-up?" His words were laced with mockery, and his tone dripped with derision. The laughter from his crew spilled out behind him, the sound almost musical in its cruelty, as if they were all in on some inside joke that Marcus wasn't privy to. It was an insult that Marcus had heard many times before, aimed at him, at other soldiers, and yet it never lost its sting. It was designed to chip away at his dignity, to reduce him from a man who had served his country with pride to little more than a joke. But Marcus didn't flinch. His hands remained steady on his glass, fingers curling around the cool surface as his gaze never wavered from Jack's. The words stung, but they didn't break him. The years of training, the discipline instilled in him from the moment he had enlisted, kicked in as his pulse steadied and his breathing remained even. He wasn't going to be provoked. Not here. Not now. His eyes remained calm, his expression still as stone, and he let the insults roll off him like water on a duck's back. The worst thing he could do right now was to let them see him lose his temper. He knew that responding with anger would only escalate things, and if there was one thing Marcus had learned during his time in the service, it was that a soldier had to remain composed, even in the face of provocation. "You've got a lot to say for a guy who doesn't know me," Marcus replied, his voice low but steady, carrying a quiet authority. He wasn't looking for a fight, but neither was he going to let Jack's words slide by without a response. "I'm just here to relax." The words were measured, calm. He didn't let the mockery get under his skin, didn't let it twist his gut into a knot. His eyes locked onto Jack's, holding the biker's gaze without flinching. He could feel the stares of the other bikers, their eyes flicking back and forth between him and their leader, waiting for something to crack, some sign that Marcus was going to rise to the bait. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. For a moment, Jack seemed to hesitate, just for the briefest second. His eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the edge of the table as he leaned in closer, bringing his face nearer to Marcus's. The sneer on his face deepened, and his voice dropped lower, a threat now lurking beneath the surface. "You think you're too good for us, huh?" Jack growled, his tone sharp and bitter. "You think you can just walk in here, wear that uniform, and get everyone to respect you?" He motioned dismissively toward Marcus's worn sneakers, the insult unmistakable in its intent. "You're just a faker. You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere." The words landed hard, but Marcus held his ground. The bar around them had grown quieter still, the patrons all but holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. The laughter from the bikers had died down, leaving only the sound of Jack's voice and the quiet clinking of glasses in the background. Everyone in the room could feel it. The tension had shifted. The atmosphere had gone from bad to worse. Marcus inhaled deeply, pushing down the surge of frustration that threatened to rise in his chest. It would have been easy to lash out, to defend his honor with words, but that wasn't why he was here. He wasn't about to allow himself to be dragged into some petty showdown in a roadside bar. "No one's asking for your respect," Marcus replied, his voice cool and even. "I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm just here to have a drink." His fingers tightened around the glass once more, steady and deliberate. "If you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with someone else." The challenge hung in the air between them, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for Jack to make the next move. Marcus didn't blink, didn't break his gaze. He could feel the tension mounting, the flicker of anger in Jack's eyes, but he refused to be the one to ignite it. Jack's grin twisted into something darker, and for a second, Marcus thought maybe they had reached the end of this exchange. But then, Jack took another step forward, his boots thudding heavily on the floor, and Marcus's muscles tensed in preparation for what was coming. "You think you can talk to me like that, soldier?" Jack spat. "You think you're going to get away with that kind of disrespect?" Before Marcus could respond, before he could even shift his weight, Jack's hand shot out, grabbing the edge of Marcus's collar and yanking him forward, the rough fabric digging into his neck. The room erupted in a collective gasp, and Marcus's pulse quickened, but his instincts were already in motion. The moment Jack's hand made contact, Marcus's training took over. He didn't need to think, didn't need to plan. It was like breathing. His right hand shot up, grabbing Jack's wrist with surgical precision, and in one swift motion, he twisted Jack's arm behind his back, using the man's momentum against him. There was a sharp crack as Jack's body was forced down toward the table, and for a moment, the room stood in stunned silence. The laughter from the bikers was silenced in an instant, replaced by an eerie stillness as everyone turned to watch what would happen next. Jack was pinned, his face red with anger and embarrassment, while Marcus remained standing, calm and collected, his grip firm but controlled. The rest of the bikers hesitated, caught off guard by the unexpected strength and precision of Marcus's move. Jack, struggling to break free, glared up at Marcus, his breathing heavy, but Marcus didn't budge. He had made his point. This wasn't a fight he wanted, but he wasn't about to let them walk all over him either. The room was silent now, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Everyone waited to see how this would unfold. The silence in the bar was deafening. Jack's face flushed with a mix of frustration and humiliation, his chest rising and falling as he tried to shake off the surprise of Marcus's swift and controlled response. His arm was still twisted behind him, and the pain was starting to creep in. But more than that, it was the sudden shift in the power dynamic that gnawed at him. For the first time since entering the bar, Jack wasn't the one in control. The realization stung, and with it, his anger surged, bubbling over into something far darker. He gritted his teeth, his eyes narrowing as he stared up at Marcus, the defiant calm on the veteran's face only serving to fuel the fire inside him. Jack was no stranger to confrontation, and he wasn't the kind of man who would back down so easily, especially not in front of his crew. He had a reputation to uphold, a toughness he needed to project. "Prove it," Jack growled, his voice low and laced with venom. His breath was hot and heavy as he leaned in closer, trying to loom over Marcus, his face inches from his. "Prove you're a real soldier. Show me some fucking papers. Show me some goddamn proof that you're not just some poser in a costume." Marcus didn't flinch, his grip still firm on Jack's arm as he stood tall, unmoving. The words hung in the air like a challenge, but Marcus wasn't going to rise to it. He wasn't here to prove anything to Jack or anyone else. His years of service, the sacrifices he made, the hardships he endured, none of that needed validation from a stranger in a bar. "I don't owe you or anyone else an explanation," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. The words were measured, carrying the weight of experience. "I don't need to prove anything to you." Jack's nostrils flared, his jaw clenching as he absorbed the words. Every fiber of his being screamed to take action, to force Marcus to react the way he wanted him to. He had to make him angry, had to make him lose control. His pride wouldn't allow him to stand there, humiliated, while Marcus remained the picture of calm composure. Jack took a step back, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides. He paced briefly, circling Marcus like a predator, his eyes never leaving him. The room felt like it was holding its breath, everyone watching, knowing that something had to give. Then, without warning, Jack's temper snapped. He lunged forward, his movements quick and aggressive, his body weight forcing Marcus back into the table. The sudden motion was violent, a desperate attempt to provoke a reaction. Jack's hand shot out, grabbing at Marcus's collar with the intent to yank him up, to throw him off balance, to create the chaos he so desperately sought. Marcus felt the shift in Jack's body before the biker even made his move. He could feel the weight in the air, the shift from taunts to something more dangerous, more personal. It was a move born from a bruised ego, and it didn't take Marcus by surprise. His instincts kicked in before Jack even made contact. With a fluid motion, Marcus sidestepped Jack's lunge, his body twisting with precision as Jack's hand grabbed nothing but air. Marcus used the biker's momentum against him, stepping behind him and grabbing Jack's arm again, twisting it with expert force. The motion was seamless, swift, and before Jack knew it, his arm was behind his back, pinning him once again, but this time it was more forceful, more deliberate. The room erupted in gasps as Jack was brought to his knees, his face contorted with frustration and pain. The bikers stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. Jack, who had always been the one to control the room, the one to dominate any space he walked into, was now at the mercy of a man who had barely flinched at his attacks. "You want proof?" Marcus said, his voice steady as ever, his grip on Jack unwavering. "I've already given it. You just don't want to see it." Jack struggled against Marcus's hold, trying to break free, but it was futile. The strength of Marcus's grip was unmatched, and the biker could feel his energy draining, his frustration mounting. The more he fought, the more his own movements worked against him. The air in the bar was thick with tension now, the entire room drawn into the standoff. Every eye was on them, every breath held in anticipation. The crew of bikers stood rigid, unsure of how to proceed, caught between their loyalty to Jack and the realization that their leader had bitten off more than he could chew. "Let him go, man!" one of the bikers called out, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and confusion. "This isn't worth it." But Jack, his face reddening with both rage and embarrassment, spat out a curse under his breath. "Get off me, you damn coward," he snarled, attempting to push himself up, but the more he tried, the more Marcus applied pressure, keeping him firmly in place. Marcus didn't budge, his voice cool as ice. "You wanted a fight, Jack. Now you've got one." It wasn't a challenge. Marcus was simply stating the facts. He wasn't here to escalate things, but he wasn't about to let Jack or anyone else walk all over him, not after everything he had been through. His training had taught him to control his emotions, to remain calm in the face of danger, and that was what he was doing now. But there was no mistaking the power in his voice, the quiet certainty that came from someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. The bikers hesitated. For a moment, it seemed as though they might intervene, but Marcus's unyielding stance, the way he had effortlessly neutralized Jack's aggression, kept them at bay. They knew better than to challenge a man who had seen things they could only imagine, a man who wasn't afraid to stand his ground. Jack's breathing was ragged now, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. He was trapped, and he knew it. The room remained dead silent, the only sound the pounding of his heart in his chest and the distant hum of the highway outside. "Get up," Marcus said, his voice still calm, still controlled. "You're done here." Jack's glare could have cut through glass, but it was clear he had no choice. His pride was shattered, his body forced into submission. Slowly, with a last defeated look at Marcus, Jack rose to his feet, the air between them still crackling with tension. He turned away, his face flushed with rage and humiliation, and without a word, the bikers followed suit, leaving the table behind. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, exhaled in unison, and the bar seemed to come back to life, the murmur of conversation rising once again. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, his gaze following the bikers as they exited the bar. His body relaxed, but his mind remained alert. The situation had diffused, but he knew better than to let his guard down completely. The world wasn't always as quiet as it seemed. For now, though, he took a deep breath and returned to his drink, the calm of the moment settling back in. As Jack lunged forward, intent on asserting his dominance over Marcus, the world seemed to slow down. The familiar rush of adrenaline flooded Marcus's system, his training taking over instinctively. It wasn't something he had to think about. It was just his body reacting, conditioned by years of discipline and the harsh lessons of survival. With lightning speed, Marcus sidestepped Jack's clumsy grab, his own body flowing with the precision of a trained athlete. He could feel Jack's momentum push forward, a small but crucial shift that made it all too easy to capitalize on. In a single, fluid motion, Marcus pivoted behind Jack, his hand sweeping to catch the biker's arm and twist it in one smooth, controlled movement. The snap of Jack's wrist and the way his shoulder contorted in response was enough to make even the toughest of men wince, but Marcus's grip remained firm, unyielding. The sound of Jack's grunt of pain filled the room, but it was quickly drowned out by the stunned silence that fell over the bar. Every patron's eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The usual clatter of glasses, the low hum of conversation, everything was stilled in a single moment of awe and disbelief. No one had expected this. No one had anticipated Marcus' quiet resolve to shatter so quickly into an act of raw, disciplined strength. Jack, now on his knees, was caught in a vice of power. His arm was bent unnaturally behind him, pressed against the wooden table, and though he tried to struggle to find some way to break free, it was clear he was trapped. The force of Marcus's hold was not brute strength. It was tactical, calculated, and absolutely precise. There was no struggle in Marcus's movements, just an effortless control that left Jack helpless. The bikers behind him were frozen in place, unable to react, unsure of how to proceed. They had expected a fight, maybe a brawl, but what they were witnessing was something else entirely. Marcus's face remained an impassive mask, but his eyes were sharp, focused entirely on Jack. He had been here before, on the battlefield in the face of danger. Every maneuver, every instinct was owned to handle situations just like this. His mind was calm, clear. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. There was no room for emotion in this moment, only control, discipline, and the knowledge that if he allowed Jack to regain any sense of composure, the situation could quickly spiral out of hand. "Let go of me, you damn coward!" Jack spat, his voice a mix of rage and embarrassment. His face was contorted in pain. His breath ragged as he struggled against the firm grip that kept him pinned to the table. "I'll crush you for this." But Marcus's grip tightened, not out of malice, but out of necessity. He didn't need to say anything. His actions were enough. The calm in his movements, the unspoken warning in the way he held Jack's arm, spoke volumes. He wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't looking for revenge. He just wanted to stop it from escalating further. The bikers, once rowdy and brash, now stood in uncertain silence, exchanging nervous glances. They had all heard the stories, of course, the tales of soldiers, veterans who had seen things in far-off lands, their bodies trained to act before their minds even registered the threat. But standing in front of Marcus, witnessing the raw capability in his eyes, the stillness in his demeanor, it was a different story altogether. None of them had expected this. None of them had expected him. Jack's face reddened further, humiliation and fury written across his features. His pride, the one thing he had always carried with him as a shield, was shattered. Every taunt, every insult he had thrown at Marcus now seemed empty, meaningless. There was no bravado left in him. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time since he had walked into that bar, Jack felt a cold, unsettling realization. He had lost. You don't know who you're dealing with," Jack snarled through clenched teeth, but even as the words left his mouth, the fire behind them was gone. His body trembled, not from fear of the pain, but from the sheer humbling weight of the situation. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. His actions had already spoken louder than any words could. He was in control, and it was clear to everyone watching that he wasn't about to let the situation spiral into something worse. His military training had given him the tools to handle chaos, had taught him how to think in a crisis, how to subdue a threat without overreacting, how to ensure that a bad situation didn't become a deadly one. "Stay down," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced far greater dangers than a man on his knees. "You've already made your point. Now sit tight." Jack's body stiffened, a momentary flicker of defiance still in his eyes. But it quickly faded. The weight of the situation was too much, the pressure on his arm too unbearable. He had no choice but to comply. For a few long seconds, Jack remained frozen, his chest heaving with every ragged breath, his face contorted in a battle between his pride and the stark reality of his defeat. The bikers, now completely thrown off balance, exchanged looks of disbelief. The tension that had hung in the air, thick and oppressive, began to shift. The realization dawning on them that this wasn't a fight they could win. Jack, their leader, was out of his depth, and the calm, controlled veteran in front of them had all the power now. They stood there, unsure of what to do, the energy in the room palpable as they weighed their options. Finally, with a resigned grunt, Jack dropped his gaze, accepting the inevitable. The bikers behind him hesitated for a moment longer before stepping back, one by one, their expressions now filled with something they hadn't expected: respect. They didn't speak, didn't move toward Marcus. They just stood there, watching as the veteran maintained his composure. The entire bar, once filled with unease and whispered murmurs, was now silent. Every patron watched, riveted by the unfolding drama. And in that silence, Marcus remained still, his posture perfect, his focus unwavering. The encounter had taken a turn no one expected. And as Jack, now defeated, sat helpless at the table, the respect of every witness was quietly earned. The air in the bar had shifted, the tension that once crackled in every corner now replaced by a stunned stillness. But the moment was fleeting. As Jack sat, nursing his arm and nursing his pride, one of his crew, Bill, a lanky biker with a nervous twitch, pulled out his phone. His hand shook as he dialed, his voice low but insistent as he spoke to the operator. "Yeah, we need the cops. This guy," he gestured toward Marcus, who was still standing, calm as ever. "He assaulted Jack. He's faking his military service. He's a fraud." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Biker's voice cracked with a mix of fear and anger, and it was enough to rattle the others. Their eyes darted to Jack, who now sat hunched over, clutching his arm with a scowl. The entire group, still caught off guard by Marcus's quick and efficient takedown, seemed to be waiting for the situation to tilt back in their favor. They had lost the physical fight, but maybe, just maybe, they could salvage something if they turned the tide in their favor with the police. Within minutes, the unmistakable sound of sirens cut through the evening air. The police cars screeched to a halt outside Hunter's Roadhouse, their flashing lights spilling onto the gravel lot and casting brief shadows over the scene. Two officers stepped out of the vehicles, a tall woman and a younger man, and they immediately assessed the atmosphere. It was tense, thick with the weight of unresolved conflict. The officer's eyes swept across the room, taking in the silent witnesses, the seated Jack, the anxious bikers, and finally, the calm figure of Marcus standing tall near the table. The woman officer, her posture commanding but her expression neutral, moved toward Jack. He lifted his injured arm in greeting, a half sneer still tugging at his lips. "This guy," Jack started, his voice raw and bitter, "he attacked me, put me in a damn arm lock, and he's lying about his military service. He's wearing a uniform, but he's not a soldier. He's faking it. He's a fraud." The younger officer glanced at Marcus, a slight wrinkle of confusion crossing his brow as he took in the situation. He wasn't sure who to trust in this moment. Marcus, however, remained unshaken. He didn't argue or shout. He didn't defend himself with the same kind of fiery anger that Jack had displayed. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his military ID, and laid it gently on the table. The young officer stepped closer, studying the ID in his hand. It was an official military identification card, adorned with the familiar seal and bearing Marcus's name and rank. The officer flipped it over, checking the expiration date and confirming its legitimacy. After a few moments, he met Marcus's gaze, nodding as he recognized the authenticity of the card. Marcus then straightened and unbuttoned the flap of his jacket to reveal his service uniform beneath. A carefully maintained but worn uniform that had seen its share of battlefields, but still carried the weight of his dedication and pride. His chest, though not broad with military decoration, was filled with something far more valuable, the quiet authority that comes from years of real-world service. His face didn't shift. His expression was unwavering as he allowed the officers to inspect his credentials. The officers exchanged a look, their earlier skepticism dissolving. The young officer gestured to his partner, who nodded and turned her attention to Jack, her voice cool but firm. "Sir, we've confirmed his credentials," she said to Jack, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll need to hear your side of the story now." Jack bristled at the lack of immediate support. The walls around him seemed to close in as the reality of the situation began to dawn on him. There was no sympathy coming from the officers. No one was buying the story he was trying to sell. As the woman officer moved closer, the tension in Jack's shoulders heightened. His once boasting bravado was now replaced by an uncomfortable sense of vulnerability. "You know," the officer continued, "filing a false report could have consequences. If you're going to accuse someone of assaulting you, you'd better have something solid to back it up." Jack opened his mouth, but the words faltered. His mind raced, trying to piece together a defense, but in the face of the officer's steady gaze, his resolve crumbled. The absurdity of the situation hit him like a wave. He had picked the wrong fight. a fight he wasn't going to win. The woman officer turned to her partner and gave a brief nod. He then stepped forward to address the bikers, the rest of whom had been waiting, nervously shifting from foot to foot. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying through the bar, "we'll be taking statements from all of you, but right now I suggest you all stay calm and cooperate. We'll sort this out." As the officer spoke, the remaining bikers grew silent, their earlier bravado evaporating. They had been caught in their own game, and now they were being scrutinized. Each of them had their own thoughts to process, but no one spoke out. The situation had turned against them faster than any of them could have anticipated. The woman officer turned her attention back to Marcus, offering him a small nod of recognition. "Thank you for your patience, sir. We've got this from here. You've done nothing wrong." Marcus simply nodded in return, his calm demeanor not faltering. He hadn't been looking for recognition or validation. All he wanted was to be left in peace. But it seemed the universe had decided to throw him into yet another battle he didn't ask for. Yet, as he stood there, his gaze unwavering, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had handled this moment with grace, with strength, and now it was out of his hands. The officer's presence was enough to put a stop to any further confrontation. The bikers, now visibly deflated, exchanged glances, but made no further move. Their pride had been wounded, their accusations dismissed. The quiet tension that had been bubbling in the room was now slowly replaced by a cautious relief. For now, Marcus had emerged victorious, and the bikers had no choice but to lick their wounds in silence. As the officers began taking statements from the witnesses, the bar began to settle into a new kind of normal. The hum of conversation started to return, but it was different now. Hushed, respectful, and with a newfound understanding of who the true authority in the room had been all along. The bar, which had once been thick with tension, now felt oddly still. The officers had already begun their rounds, taking statements from the witnesses and jotting down their notes. The silence, broken only by the occasional murmur from the officers or the clink of glass, settled over the room like a heavy curtain. The bikers, now cowed and defeated, stood in an uncomfortable huddle near the door, their defiant postures gone. They exchanged quick, furtive glances, their heads lowered, as the officers finished up. Jack, his arm still held stiffly against his side, cast one last resentful look toward Marcus. There was a flicker of anger in his eyes, but it was quickly smothered by the reality of the situation. He had come into this bar ready to dominate, to put someone in their place. Now, he was the one on the receiving end of an authority he had not expected. The satisfaction he'd once felt had withered, replaced by a gnawing sense of defeat. The woman officer stepped up to him, her tone firm but not unkind. "Mr. Jack, I suggest you think carefully about your actions tonight. Making false accusations could lead to serious consequences. The truth has come to light, and there's no excuse for instigating an altercation like this." Jack opened his mouth to protest, but he didn't have the words. Instead, he nodded curtly, his shoulders slumping as the officer turned away. Without another word, Jack shuffled toward the door, followed closely by the other bikers. One by one, they filed out of the bar, their once loud voices now silent, their swagger dissolved into the weight of their shame. The door swung shut behind them with a soft thud, and the sound seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. The patrons, who had been watching the confrontation with unease, now looked toward Marcus. The quiet respect in their eyes was palpable. No one spoke, but the atmosphere had changed. Where there had been tension and fear, there was now admiration, even gratitude. The patrons who had once glanced away or shifted uncomfortably now found themselves watching Marcus, standing strong, unbowed, and composed, like someone who had endured much and still managed to rise above it all. The bartender, who had been on edge throughout the altercation, slowly wiped his hands on a towel, his eyes lingering on Marcus. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but sincere. Marcus met the bartender's gaze and nodded. "I'm fine. Just glad it's over." His voice was calm, with none of the edge or anger that had marked the earlier part of the evening. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but there was a sense of peace in his demeanor, as if he had finally found a moment to exhale. A few of the patrons, braver now that the storm had passed, offered small nods or murmurs of support. A man sitting at the bar, one of the regulars who had been watching from a distance, finally spoke up, his voice steady but filled with admiration. Hell of a way to handle things, man. I didn't think that guy was going to stop running his mouth. He chuckled softly, a small but genuine laugh that lightened the mood. But you kept it together. Not everyone could have done that. Marcus gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Sometimes you just have to keep calm. Can't let people like that drag you down to their level. The man nodded in agreement, his gaze briefly flicking to the door where the bikers had exited. That's true. They were out of line, no doubt. But the way you handled it, respect. The bartender slid a glass of water in front of Marcus, his hands steady despite the tense situation that had unfolded only moments before. On the house, he said, a silent gesture of appreciation. Marcus took the glass, feeling the coolness of it seep into his palms. He appreciated the offer, but he didn't need the recognition. What mattered most in that moment was the quiet sense of respect that had begun to take root in the bar. The patrons, the ones who had been witnesses to the events, were now treating him with a different kind of reverence, not because of his military service, but because of the quiet dignity with which he had responded to the provocation. For the first time that night, Marcus allowed himself to relax. The weight of the encounter with the bikers had left him, replaced by the soothing recognition that he hadn't let the situation consume him. He had kept his cool. He had handled it. He had stood firm in the face of hostility and walked away with his integrity intact. Outside, the night sky stretched wide and open, free from the clouds of conflict that had hung over the bar just hours before. The bar was still and peaceful once again. As Marcus sat back in his chair, the earlier tension melting away like ice under the warmth of a setting sun, he realized that the events of the evening had reaffirmed something important within him. He had been tested, not just by the bikers, but by the world in general. And in that moment, as he sat quietly in the corner of the roadhouse, he knew that the fight for respect wasn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it was about standing your ground without firing a shot. The bartender gave him a knowing nod as he moved back down the bar, and the other patrons slowly returned to their conversations. The hum of voices and clink of glass gradually returned to the familiar rhythm of the evening. But now it was accompanied by something else, a sense of quiet gratitude, a feeling that lingered long after the bikers had left, long after the last of the tension had dissipated into the cool night air. And Marcus? He sat back and took a long, slow sip of his drink, feeling the weight of his journey, of the battle fought and won, settle into the peace of the present moment. There, amid the hum of conversation and the warmth of the community that had seen him through, he found a rare sense of belonging. A place where strength and calm met, where integrity spoke louder than words. And as the night wore on, he let the lingering sense of peace wash over him, a quiet triumph that would stay with him long after the darkness had swallowed the horizon. The morning air was crisp when Marcus heard the faint knock at his door. It was a soft, almost tentative sound, the kind that spoke of hesitation and uncertainty. He wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment he wondered if it was some lingering fallout from the night at Hunter's Roadhouse. He had barely had time to process everything, let alone think about how it had affected those who witnessed the altercation. As he stood up from his kitchen table, where he had been sipping his coffee, Marcus felt an odd tug of anticipation mixed with wariness. He opened the door, and there, standing on the porch, was Bill, the biker who had been part of the group that had caused so much trouble at the bar. Bill looked out of place on Marcus's doorstep, a stark contrast to the rowdy, defiant figure he had been just days before. His leather jacket seemed to hang a little differently, like it had grown heavier since the last time Marcus had seen him. His rough hands fidgeted nervously with the zipper of his jacket, and his eyes darted around, not meeting Marcus's gaze. There was an unspoken weight between them, one that was heavy with the things left unsaid. But Bill took a deep breath, steeling himself before finally speaking. "Hey man," Bill began, his voice hesitant but sincere. I'm not sure how to start this, but I owe you an apology." Marcus stood there for a moment, taking in Bill's words. He was surprised, certainly, but he said nothing at first, allowing Bill to continue on his own. Bill shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I know I was part of that mess the other night. I was with Jack and the others, and I didn't handle things right. I got caught up in all that energy, in his bullshit, and I said things I shouldn't have. Things that weren't fair to you." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply watched Bill, his gaze steady and calm. He had been through enough confrontations to know that this was no easy thing for Bill to do, standing here, admitting his mistakes. It was rare for someone to come back and own up to their wrongs, especially after all the noise had died down. And for a moment, Marcus realized that Bill's visit wasn't about redemption in the eyes of others. It was about Bill trying to make peace with himself. Bill continued, his voice thickening with regret. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that. What happened with Jack, all the shit we said, none of that was on you. You handled yourself with more dignity than any of us could have, and I respect that." The words hung in the air between them, and for a brief moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Marcus stood still, his expression unreadable. This was more than he had expected. After the confrontation, he had assumed that was the end of it. His own sense of justice had been served. The bikers had slunk off in silence, their bravado deflated, and that was supposed to be the final chapter of the story. But here Bill was, stepping out from the shadows of their past actions, seeking something more. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice low and steady. "It takes a lot of courage to come here, Bill. I didn't expect this." Bill nodded, his face flushed with the awkwardness of the moment. "I know it's not much. Hell, it probably doesn't fix anything, but I felt like I needed to at least say it to your face, to apologize for being part of that, for making you feel like you had to prove something." Marcus gave a small nod, appreciating the sincerity in Bill's words. He had been in situations where a man's actions spoke louder than any apology, but this moment felt different. Bill wasn't making excuses. He wasn't hiding behind his crew's actions. He was standing here, face to face with the man he had wronged, and that in itself spoke volumes. "I'm not looking for apologies," Marcus replied, "but I do respect you for coming here. Not everyone would do that." Bill's eyes softened, the weight of the conversation sinking in. "I couldn't just walk away from it. I had to come clean. You were right about the way you handled it. I can't say I would have done the same, but I can respect how you kept it together. It's something I've got to learn." Marcus looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it's not about how you handle things in the heat of the moment," he said quietly. "It's about what you do after. The fact that you came here shows me something. Maybe that's the first step for you." Bill met Marcus's gaze, and there was a flicker of something deeper behind his eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or the realization that he wasn't as lost as he had once believed. "I'm trying, man," he said softly. "I'm trying to be better, to do better." Marcus offered a small, quiet smile. "It's a start." Bill nodded slowly, seeming to grasp the importance of the exchange. "I'll leave you be now. But thanks. Really." As Bill turned to leave, Marcus watched him go, the man's heavy boots leaving soft impressions in the dirt. For a moment, he stood there, reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought them to this point. It was rare that someone was able to see the error in their ways, especially when pride and influence had made them act out of turn. But Bill had done just that. And while it didn't erase the past, it was a step forward, a step toward understanding and growth. Marcus closed the door behind him, his thoughts lingering on the conversation. He knew that this moment was a small victory, not just for him, but for Bill as well. They had both been tested in different ways, and in some strange way, they had both emerged better for it. And as he sat back down at his kitchen table, a sense of peace settled over him. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But this encounter, this moment of unexpected humility, had made him realize that change could come from the most unexpected places, even in the people who had once stood against you. Sometimes redemption wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the quiet, sincere steps that followed the chaos. After closing the door behind Bill, Marcus stood in the dim quiet of his living room, the sounds of the world outside muffled by the walls of his small home. It was strange how such a simple gesture, Bill's apology, could leave such a profound impact. Marcus had expected to feel a sense of vindication, perhaps even triumph, after the confrontation at the bar. He had shown them all who he was, steadfast, unyielding, and above reproach. But this moment, this quiet reconciliation with Bill, carried a weight that was different. It was heavier, but in a way that felt purifying. As he sank into his armchair, the thoughts and emotions from the past few days began to unravel in his mind. Bill's words had been genuine. There was no denying that. But it wasn't just the apology that had struck Marcus. It was the vulnerability behind it. A man like Bill, a biker who had once been part of a group that ridiculed and threatened him, had stepped forward to confront his own mistakes. Marcus had no illusions about the difficulty of that act. In a world where pride and reputation often held more weight than integrity, it took courage to admit wrongs and seek forgiveness. And though Marcus had every right to dismiss Bill's apology, his life was full of people who had been less than kind. He couldn't help but feel something stir inside him. It was a sense of hope, perhaps, that change wasn't impossible. That people could, in fact, evolve if given the chance. He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the sliver of sun setting over the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple. The beauty of it made him pause. It was moments like this that reminded him why he had fought so hard. Not just for his country, but for the belief that the world could be better, that people could be better. But he also knew it was never simple. Change didn't come easily, and the fight against ignorance, prejudice, and hatred was never over. It was an ongoing struggle, one that would require more than just physical strength. It would take patience, perseverance, and, perhaps most difficult of all, understanding. Marcus thought back to the night at Hunter's Roadhouse. Tension in the air had been thick enough to cut with a knife, the words exchanged sharp and pointed. And yet, despite the mockery, the hostility, and the threats, he had remained calm. He hadn't risen to the bait, hadn't let his anger dictate his actions. Instead, he had responded with dignity, with the quiet strength of a man who knew that sometimes silence was the most powerful response. The bikers had left in disgrace, and the police had sided with him. But that wasn't the end of the story, Marcus realized. It was just the beginning. Because even in the aftermath of that conflict, there would be more battles to face. More moments when people would doubt him, belittle him, or try to force him to prove himself. And while it was easy to believe that the world would change overnight, Marcus understood that true progress came in small, often unseen steps. It came from moments like this one, where someone like Bill could stand up, admit his wrongs, and show that there was still room for growth. Marcus smiled to himself, though there was no joy in the expression. It was more of a quiet acknowledgement of the path he had chosen. He had always known that the fight for equality and respect was never a fight that could be won in one battle. It was a lifelong struggle. And sometimes victory came not in grand gestures, but in the quieter moments. Those moments when people chose to be better, even when it was hard. The door to change wasn't always wide open. Sometimes it was just a crack. But it was enough. Enough for Bill to step through, and enough for Marcus to recognize that even small steps mattered. His own journey had been filled with hardships, with moments where the weight of the world seemed unbearable. But he had always pushed forward, and he would continue to do so. Not just for himself, but for the people who would come after him. For the future that might one day be brighter because of the struggles of today. As the evening settled into darkness, Marcus stood up, stretching his legs. He walked over to the small table where a photo of his family sat, his mother, father, and siblings, all smiling together at a time when life seemed simpler. He ran his fingers over the glass, remembering the reasons he had gone to war in the first place. They were the same reasons that drove him now. To make the world a better place. To ensure that the future his children would inherit would be one where people were judged not by the color of their skin or the uniform they wore, but by the content of their character. He let out a long, steady breath, feeling the weight of the moment sink into his bones. It had been a long, hard road back to this place, but he had arrived. And with each step he took, he would continue to meet the world with strength and integrity. He knew it wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready for it. With one last glance at the photo, Marcus turned off the light, leaving his home bathed in the soft glow of the street lamp outside. He closed the door behind him, stepping into the night air with a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but he was prepared for whatever came next. because he knew, deep down, that even the smallest gestures could spark the kind of change that was needed. And in that quiet, resolute moment, Marcus made a vow to himself. He would continue to rise above the hatred, the prejudice, and the ignorance. He would continue to be a force for good, because the world was waiting, and it was up to him and others like him to shape it. This story is not just about a confrontation, but a journey of resilience, self-control, and the quiet strength of maintaining composure in the face of adversity. Marcus, with his calm demeanor and unwavering integrity, faced hostility not with anger or revenge, but with steadiness and honor. His actions prove that, in a world full of prejudice and misunderstanding, true strength comes from silence, patience, and the ability to stand firm in the face of challenges. The story also reminds us that, while the road ahead may be long and difficult, every small step forward matters. Acknowledging our mistakes, apologizing, and striving to change are essential acts in moving toward greater understanding and compassion. When each individual dares to face their flaws and works to be better, these small acts become the foundation for a fairer and kinder society. In the end, Marcus realizes that he is not alone in his struggles. The path ahead may still be difficult, but with determination, patience, and understanding, he knows that even small changes can create ripples of hope and lead to a brighter future. Ultimately, this story is a reminder of the power of compassion, the potential for change within each of us, and the impact of small, meaningful actions. No matter how harsh life may be, as long as we hold on to the belief in positive change, the actions of individuals, no matter how small, can build a stronger, more compassionate world for all. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Your time, attention, and willingness to dive into this story mean the world. We hope the themes of resilience, compassion, and personal growth have left you inspired and ready to face your own challenges with strength and grace. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to stay connected. Don't miss out on more powerful narratives and moments that touch the heart. Subscribe now and be the first to experience stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Let's continue this journey together, where every chapter brings us closer to understanding and every story leaves a lasting impact. Click that subscribe button and let's grow together in this shared space of connection and growth. Thank you once again, and we look forward to having you with us for the next chapter.